actresses of her day, known for her great beauty and said to be the inspiration for Catwoman and Snow White. But there was a part of her life that almost no one knew about. It turns out Hedy Lamarr was also a brilliant inventor.
She was the most beautiful woman in the world, a genius who changed technology forever. And when she died, she left her 3 children with almost nothing. One was thrown away at 12 years old. One spent years in court fighting for what was rightfully his. And one sacrificed everything for her, only to be left completely empty-handed. The secrets she hid destroyed the people closest to her. What really happened behind closed doors will leave you absolutely speechless.
Basic idea of frequency hopping became part of what's known as spread spectrum. Spread spectrum is what's in all of our technology today. I mean, Bluetooth is probably the most purely similar to what Hedy Lamarr invented, and Wi-Fi too. But spread spectrum is in...
Hedy Lamarr was, by almost any measure, one of the most remarkable people of the 20th century. She was a film star at a time when film stars were treated like royalty. She was an inventor whose ideas were so far ahead of their time that the world did not catch up with them for decades. She was a mother of 3 children whose lives were shaped in very different ways by the enormous shadow she cast. And she was a woman whose public image and private reality were separated by a distance that most people never got to see across. To tell the story of her children properly, you have to start with her. Not the version of her that appeared on magazine covers or cinema screens, but the fuller, more complicated person underneath all of that. Because the kind of parent Hedy Lamarr was, the choices she made, the things she prioritized, and the things she let go of, cannot be understood without first understanding who she was and what her life actually looked like from the inside. She was born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler in Vienna, Austria, in November 1914. Her father was a bank director and her mother was a pianist, and she grew up in a household that was cultured, educated, and reasonably comfortable. From an early age, she showed a strong interest in performance. She began acting in her teens, and by the time she was in her early 20s, she had already appeared in a film that would follow her for the rest of her life. The film was called Ecstasy, released in 1933, and it caused a considerable amount of controversy at the time due to its content. Hedy was not yet 20 when she made it, and the attention it brought her was not entirely the kind she would have chosen. Around that same time, she married for the first time. Her husband was Friedrich Mandl, an Austrian arms manufacturer who was extremely wealthy and, by most accounts, extremely controlling. He did not want his wife appearing in films or mixing with people he had not approved of, and he monitored her movements closely. Hedy later described the marriage as a kind of imprisonment. She eventually fled, making her way to London and then to the United States, where she reinvented herself almost entirely. The reinvention involved a new name, a new country, and a new career. She signed with MGM, one of the most powerful film studios in Hollywood at the time, and was given the screen name Hedy Lamarr. From the late 1930s onwards, she appeared in a string of successful films, and her face became one of the most recognizable in the world. Publications referred to her as the most beautiful woman in the world, and that description followed her everywhere. It was meant as a compliment. Over time, it became something closer to a trap, reducing a highly intelligent and multidimensional person to a single physical attribute. The films she made during this period were popular and commercially successful. She appeared alongside some of the biggest names in Hollywood, worked with major directors, and earned a level of fame that very few people ever experience. But her personal life, running alongside all of this, was considerably less stable than her professional one. Between 1933 and 1963, Hedy Lamarr was married 6 times. 6 separate marriages, 6 separations, and all the upheaval that comes with that kind of pattern. Her husbands included a screenwriter, a British actor, a Texas oil magnate, a steel tycoon, and a writer. Each marriage began with what appeared to be genuine optimism and ended in disappointment or conflict. What that kind of instability means for children is not difficult to imagine. Hedy had 3 children in total. The first was a boy named James, who came into her household in 1939 and was raised as her son. The second was a daughter named Denise, born in 1945. The third was a son named Anthony, born in 1947. Each of them grew up in a home that was shaped by their mother's fame, her professional pressures, and the constant movement that came with her lifestyle. New husbands, new houses, new schools, and a mother who was often working, traveling, or dealing with the particular demands that come with being one of the most famous people on the planet. By most accounts, Hedy was not a conventional mother. She was not the kind of parent who was reliably present, steady in her routines, and focused primarily on the domestic side of life. Nannies and household staff were a constant presence in her children's lives, stepping in to handle the day-to-day care that Hedy was not always able to provide. This was not unusual for wealthy households of that era, and it was particularly common in the world of Hollywood, where the demands of a film career could be all-consuming. But it did mean that James, Denise, and Anthony experienced their mother at a remove, at least some of the time. That said, the picture of Hedy as a parent is not entirely one of absence or indifference. People who knew the family, and her children themselves in the accounts they gave over the years, have described a woman who was capable of real warmth and genuine affection. She cared about her children. She was interested in them. She could be fun, engaging, and present in ways that clearly left a mark. The complications of her parenting were not rooted in a lack of feeling. They were rooted in who she was as a person, someone who moved fast, felt things intensely, and found it difficult to sustain the kind of quiet, unglamorous consistency that raising children actually requires. There is something else worth understanding about Hedy Lamarr before getting into the specific stories of her 3 children, and that is the gap between how the world saw her and what she was actually capable of. During the Second World War, while still a working actress, she co-developed a patent for a radio communication system that was designed to make torpedo guidance signals harder for enemies to intercept and jam. She worked on this with a composer named George Antheil, and together they submitted the patent in 1942. The idea involved switching radio frequencies in a coordinated pattern, an approach that the military did not adopt at the time, but that would later form part of the conceptual foundation for wireless communication technologies, including Bluetooth and aspects of modern Wi-Fi. The patent was ignored for years. Hedy never made any money from it, and for most of her life, the scientific press and the general public showed very little interest in recognizing what she had done. The world was far more interested in her face than her mind, and she was aware of that imbalance, even if she could not do much about it. It was a frustration that at least one of her children would carry forward, eventually making it a central mission of their adult life. These are the threads that run through the story of Hedy Lamarr's family, a woman of extraordinary talent and complexity, a personal life defined by movement and change, 3 children navigating their own paths in the long shadow of her fame, and a legacy that, for a long time, was only half told. The stories of James, Denise, and Anthony are each very different from one another, but they all begin in the same place, with a mother who was, in almost every sense of the word, larger than life. Of the 3 children Hedy Lamarr left behind, James had the most complicated story. It began before he was old enough to understand any of it, unfolded over the course of nearly a century, and ended with questions that were never fully answered. His life touched on almost every theme that runs through Hedy's broader story: adoption, rejection, silence, reunion, deception, and the particular kind of grief that comes from being cut off by someone who was supposed to love you unconditionally. And yet, despite all of that, James Lamar Loder built a life that was, by most reasonable measures, a good one. That tension between what was done to him and what he made of himself is what makes his story worth telling in full. The circumstances of James's arrival in Hedy's life are, even now, not entirely straightforward. Hedy maintained throughout her lifetime that James was adopted. She was consistent on this point, returning to it whenever the subject came up, and the official version of events was that she and her second husband, a screenwriter named Gene Markey, had brought a baby boy into their home in 1939 and raised him as their own. The adoption, according to Hedy, had taken place during this marriage, and James was presented to the world as her son without much further elaboration. Whether all the paperwork was handled through formal legal channels or whether the arrangement was managed more informally in the way that things sometimes were in that era is not entirely clear. But James came into the household, and for a time at least, the family appeared to function. The marriage to Gene Markey did not last, as most of Hedy's marriages did not. When it ended, there was a custody dispute over James, and Hedy went to court to fight for the right to keep him. She won. By 1941, James was fully in her care. Shortly afterwards, Hedy married again, this time to a British actor named John Loder, and James took his new stepfather's surname, becoming James Lamarr Loder. On paper, it looked like a stable arrangement: a well-known mother, a respected stepfather, and a young boy growing up in a privileged corner of California. But the reality underneath that surface was a good deal more difficult. As James got older, things between him and his mother became strained. By the time he was approaching the end of primary school, Hedy was finding him increasingly difficult to manage. He was considered, by accounts from that period, a problem child, though the specific details of his behavior are not particularly well documented. What is documented is the consequence of it. James was eventually asked to leave the Chadwick School in California following some kind of incident, and the school made it clear it did not want him to return. What came next was the kind of decision that sounds entirely reasonable from a child's point of view, and was, apparently, devastating from his mother's. A teacher at the school, a woman named Ingrid Gray, approached Hedy with an offer. She and her husband were willing to let James live with them during the school year. This would allow him to stay enrolled, maintain his friendships, and keep some continuity in his life at a time when continuity was in short supply. For a boy who had already been through considerable upheaval, the idea of staying close to his friends and familiar surroundings made obvious sense. James agreed to the arrangement. Hedy took it as a personal rejection. In her interpretation, her son had looked at two options and chosen someone else's home over hers. She was hurt by that, and rather than working through it or finding some way to remain connected to James despite the arrangement, she pulled back. She became, in James's own words, disenchanted with him. And then, in 1953, when James was around 12 years old, she cut off contact altogether. She stopped responding to his letters. She returned the ones he sent to her. She refused visits. Effectively, she removed him from her life while he was still a child. The cruelty of the timing is hard to overstate. Just a few years before that, Hedy had stood in a courtroom and argued that James should be with her. She had fought for custody. And then, within a relatively short space of time, she made a decision that was the opposite of everything that legal battle had seemed to mean. A 12-year-old boy, who had done nothing more than make a decision about where he wanted to go to school, found himself cut off from his mother, without explanation, without warning, and without any obvious path back to her. No birthday cards came, no phone calls, no visits or letters that were actually welcomed. The silence was total, and it stretched on for years. James was left to make sense of it on his own, which is an enormous thing to ask of anyone, let alone a child. What is remarkable is how James responded to all of this. He did not collapse under the weight of it. He moved away from Hollywood, away from the world his mother occupied, and he built something entirely his own. By the 1960s, he had settled in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a long way in every sense from the California film industry. He became a police officer, which is the kind of career that asks a great deal of a person and gives back in ways that have nothing to do with status or glamour. It is community work, patient and often difficult, and the fact that James was drawn to it says something about who he had become despite his upbringing. In 1967, he married a woman named Ona Miner, and together they raised 4 children. Here is a detail that is easy to read past, but probably should not be. James gave each of his 4 children the middle name Lamarr. Think about what that means. This was a man who had been rejected by his mother at the age of 12, ignored for decades, and left without any meaningful relationship with her for most of his adult life. And yet he chose to carry her name into the next generation, threading it through his own children, as if to keep something alive that she herself had seemed determined to extinguish. Whether that was forgiveness, or grief, or simply a way of acknowledging the significance of where he had come from, it was a deliberate choice. James made it knowingly. As he got older, James began to think more carefully about the story he had been told about himself. Hedy had always said he was adopted, but the details of his early life did not quite add up to him in the way that a straightforward adoption story should. The timing of his birth, relative to Hedy's marriages, the circumstances of how he had entered the household, the fact that John Loder's surname had been attached to him. These things sat uneasily with him. At some point in his adult life, he obtained what he believed was a copy of his birth certificate. The document, as he understood it, listed his mother as Hedwig Kiesler, which was Hedy Lamarr's birth name, and his father as John Loder. If accurate, that would mean James was not adopted at all. It would mean he was Hedy's biological son, born before her marriage to Loder, the result of an affair she had been having while still married to Jean Markey. That interpretation changed everything for James, at least in terms of how he understood his own history. He had spent decades believing he was an adopted child who had been discarded. Now he believed he was a secret biological son who had been lied to, hidden away, and given a false story about his origins so that Hedy could protect her reputation at a time when an illegitimate child would have caused considerable professional and social damage. The rejection no longer seemed like a mother simply losing patience with a difficult child. It seemed like something more deliberate, more calculated, and far more painful. Armed with that belief, James did something that required a significant amount of courage. He reached out to his mother. This was in the late 1980s, nearly 40 years after the silence had begun. He was in his late 40s or early 50s. Hedy was in her mid-70s. Whatever he had carried through all those years, the hurt, the confusion, the unanswered questions, he was willing to try. The reconnection happened through phone calls. James later spoke about those conversations with a warmth that is striking, given everything that had come before. He described his mother's voice as lively and sharp, as though the decades had not diminished her at all. She was engaging and present in a way that clearly meant a great deal to him. At some point, she sent him a photograph of the two of them from his childhood, and she had written on it herself. The inscription, in essence, expressed that she thought he would want a picture of them together, and she signed it with love, from Mom. After 50 years of silence, those words on the back of a photograph carried an enormous amount of weight. It was not a full reconciliation. It was not an explanation or an apology or a resolution of anything, but it suggested that Hedy had not been entirely unmoved by what had passed between them. The reconnection, unfortunately, did not develop into anything more substantial. There were no reunions, no long conversations that resolved the decades of distance. In January 2000, Hedy Lamarr died in Florida at the age of 85. When her will was read, James discovered he had been excluded entirely. The estate was divided between Denise and Anthony. James received nothing. He challenged the will. His argument was that if he was Hedy's biological firstborn child, he had a legitimate claim to a share of her estate. A DNA test was arranged to settle the matter. The results, when they came back, were definitive. James was not biologically related to Hedy Lamarr. He was not biologically related to John Loder either. Whatever the birth certificate had appeared to say, whatever interpretation James had placed on it, the science told a different story. Hedy had been telling the truth all along. James was adopted. The legal dispute was settled after the DNA results were confirmed, with James receiving a reported payment of around $50,000 from the estate in exchange for dropping his claim. It was a resolution, but not the one he had been looking for. The story he had built around himself, the one in which he was a hidden biological son rather than a discarded adopted child, turned out not to be true. And that left him, in some ways, exactly where he had started. A man who had been let go by a mother he never fully understood, carrying questions about his origins that the DNA test had answered in one sense but left open in others. Where James actually came from, who his biological parents were, was never established. James Lamarr Loder died in 2022 in Omaha, Nebraska, at the age of 84. He had outlived his mother by more than 2 decades. He had served his community, raised a family, and carried the name Lamarr through to the next generation, despite everything that name had cost him personally. He had not performed his pain for public consumption. He had simply lived as fully and as steadily as he could with a history that would have broken a great many people. That, in the end, is probably the most honest way to describe what James Lamarr Loder was. He was a man who kept going. If James's story is defined by distance and silence, then Denise's is defined by something quieter and, in many ways, more hopeful. She did not make headlines. She was not involved in legal disputes or dramatic reconciliations. She did not spend her adult life fighting for recognition or nursing a wound that refused to heal. Instead, she did something that is arguably harder and certainly less visible than any of that. She simply built a good life, on her own terms, in her own corner of the world, and she did it without leaning on her mother's name or running from it either. That is a more difficult thing to pull off than it might sound, particularly when your mother happens to be one of the most famous women who ever lived. Denise was born on the 19th of January, 1945, during Hedy's marriage to British actor John Loder. Unlike James, whose place in the family would later become the subject of a court case and a DNA test. Denise's origins were never in dispute. She was Hedy and John's biological daughter, and from the beginning, the relationship between mother and child was warmer and more straightforward than anything Hedy had managed with James. That does not mean it was simple. Nothing in Hedy Lamarr's household was ever entirely simple, but the foundation was solid in a way that James had never quite experienced, and that difference showed up in the way Denise moved through her life. She came into the world at a moment when her mother was still very much at the height of her Hollywood career. Hedy was appearing in commercially successful films, her face was on magazine covers, and the machinery of the studio system was still very much built around people like her. The arrival of a baby represented a different kind of chapter, one that existed outside the camera lights and the carefully managed public image. For a time, at least, Hedy was simply a mother with a young child at home. How long that domestic chapter lasted in any meaningful sense is another matter entirely. It did not last particularly long. Hedy and John Loder divorced in 1947 when Denise was just 2 years old. Anthony, her younger brother, had been born just months before the marriage fell apart, which meant that from very early in their lives, both children were growing up without their father as a regular presence. Hedy went on to marry 3 more times after the divorce from Loder, which meant that Denise and Anthony experienced a series of new stepfathers arriving and departing, new addresses, new schools, and the kind of general atmosphere of change and movement that makes it difficult for a child to feel entirely settled. Stability was not a word that described Hedy's household during those years, and anyone who grew up inside it would have known that. And yet Denise has spoken about her mother with genuine warmth over the years, describing a woman who was capable of real affection and who showed a softer, more private side of herself within the family that the public rarely got to see. The chaos of Hedy's personal life was real, but it did not cancel out the love. Denise has been clear about that distinction, and it is an important one. The picture of Hedy as a mother is not simply a picture of absence or neglect. It is more complicated than that, and Denise carries that complexity with a kind of honesty that speaks well of her. From a relatively young age, it became clear that Denise had a talent for art. Drawing and painting came naturally to her, and she pursued them seriously rather than as a passing interest. By the time she was a teenager, she had already won several art awards and had held her first gallery showing while still in high school. That is not a modest achievement for someone of that age. It suggests a level of commitment and ability that goes well beyond casual creativity, and it pointed clearly towards what the direction of her life was going to be. When Denise was 16, she was given an opportunity that most young artists could only dream about. She traveled to Paris to study art for 6 months. This would have been in the early 1960s, a period when Paris still carried enormous weight in the art world, drawing creative people from across the globe and offering an environment thick with history and contemporary energy in equal measure. During her time there, Denise spent time around working artists, including the American painter Larry Rivers, who was associated with the New York School and known for a style that blended abstract and figurative approaches in unusual and striking ways. She also immersed herself in the French Impressionist works that filled the city's galleries and museums, absorbing the kind of visual education that simply cannot be replicated in a classroom. For a teenager still forming her artistic identity, it was an extraordinarily rich place to be, and it clearly left a lasting impression. She returned to the United States with a clearer sense of who she was and what she wanted to pursue. She enrolled at the University of California, Berkeley, as an art major, and continued developing her work with a seriousness of purpose that was evident to the people around her. This was the same period during which Hedy's film career was beginning to slow down. The great era of the Hollywood studios was changing. The kinds of roles that had suited Hedy were becoming harder to find, and the financial security and social position that came with being a major film star were becoming less certain. Denise, to her credit, did not appear to be looking to her mother's world for a template. She was at her easel, doing her own work, building her own voice as an artist. In 1966, at the age of 21, Denise got married. Her husband was a man named Larry Colton, who had briefly played professional baseball for the Philadelphia Phillies before moving into writing. The two had met at university. Hedy attended the wedding, and photographs from the day show a mother at her daughter's side, looking proud and clearly happy to be there. It is a striking image when you consider how different Hedy's relationship with James had been. Here was a version of her that existed outside the studio and outside the public eye, just a mother at her daughter's wedding, present in the way that a parent is supposed to be present for moments like that. After the wedding, Denise moved with Larry to the Pacific Northwest, settling in the Seattle area. It was about as far from Hollywood as you could get while remaining in the continental United States, and that distance suited her well. She was not trying to escape her mother's fame exactly, but she was not trading on it either. She was living quietly, making art, and building a family. She and Larry had a daughter together named Wendy, who became Hedy Lamarr's first grandchild. People who knew Denise during those years in Seattle described her as content. That is a word that does not always get the credit it deserves. Content does not mean stagnant or unambitious. It means someone who has found a way to live that suits them, that feels right, and that does not require constant external validation to sustain. While Hedy's own life during that same period was generating headlines for difficult reasons, including a shoplifting incident in the late 1960s that received considerable press attention, and a ghost-written autobiography that caused controversy when it was published, Denise kept her head down and stayed out of it. She was not interested in the drama. She had her family and her work, and that was enough. Her marriage to Larry Colton eventually ended in divorce in the early 1970s, but Denise remained in Seattle. The city had become her home in a genuine sense, not just a place she happened to be living. She had put down roots, built friendships, and found a community that she was part of in a meaningful way. Some years after the divorce, she remarried. Her second husband was an Italian-American man with the surname Duca, and it is as Denise Loder Duca that she is known today by most people who are familiar with her story. Through all the changes in her personal life, art remained constant. She became an art teacher in Seattle, passing her knowledge and enthusiasm on to students while continuing to develop and exhibit her own work. She held gallery showings throughout the 1970s and 1980s, building a genuine reputation in the local arts community over time. This was not a celebrity's daughter, filling her days with a hobby. This was a working artist with a serious body of work, earning recognition in a competitive field on the strength of what she actually produced. The fact that her mother happened to be Hedy Lamarr was, in the context of her artistic career, largely irrelevant. Denise earned what she had. As the decades passed, something began to change in the way the world talked about Hedy Lamarr. For most of Hedy's lifetime, the conversation about her had been almost entirely focused on her appearance. She was the most beautiful woman in the world, and that was the headline that everything else got pushed behind. Her scientific work, the frequency hopping patent she had co-developed during the Second World War, had been largely ignored or dismissed during her lifetime. It was only in the 1990s, as researchers and technology historians began tracing the origins of modern wireless communication systems, that Hedy's contributions started to receive any serious attention. People began to understand that the principles behind her wartime patent had contributed in important ways to the development of technologies that billions of people now use every single day. Denise watched this shift happen, and she stepped into a quiet but meaningful role as someone who could speak to who Hedy actually was as a person. She began appearing at events that celebrated her mother's legacy, speaking with the kind of authority that only someone who actually knew her could bring to the conversation. She was not doing this loudly or in search of attention. She was doing it because she had known a side of Hedy that the world had not seen, and because she felt that the fuller picture deserved to be told. She wanted people to understand that her mother was more than a face from old Hollywood, more than a collection of tabloid stories and failed marriages. She was someone with a real mind and a genuine passion for ideas, and the world had taken a very long time to catch up with that. Today, Denise Loder Duca is in her late 70s and, by all accounts, still active as an artist. She continues to live in the Seattle area, participates in local gallery events, and presents herself to the world primarily as a painter rather than as the daughter of a famous actress. She made her own life. She took the complicated circumstances of her childhood, the famous mother, the absent father figures, the constant movement and change, and she turned them into something stable and creative and genuinely her own. For all the noise and glamour and difficulty that surrounded Hedy Lamarr, what she passed on to her daughter appears to have been something quieter and more lasting than any of that. A love of beauty, a commitment to craft, and the understanding that a life built around making things is a life worth having. Anthony Loder was the youngest of Hedy Lamarr's 3 children, and the one whose life became most directly shaped by who she was rather than who he was. That is not to say he lacked a sense of himself. He clearly did not. But the mission that came to define his later years, the long and often frustrating campaign to ensure his mother was remembered as a serious thinker and not just a beautiful face from a vanished era of Hollywood, was one he took on with a dedication that ultimately cost him a great deal of time and energy. He gave those things willingly, and because he did, the world knows Hedy Lamarr's full story in a way that it almost certainly would not have otherwise. He was born on the 1st of February 1947, just a few months before his parents' marriage came to an end. His father, the British actor John Loder, was gone from the household before Anthony was old enough to form any real memory of him. From that point on, his world was essentially his mother, his sister Denise, and whatever stepfather happened to be in the picture at any given moment. Despite the unsettled nature of that upbringing, Anthony spoke warmly about Hedy throughout his life and described a genuine closeness between them that persisted even as he grew more aware of her complexities and contradictions. As a teenager, Anthony learned about the patent his mother had co-developed during the Second World War. Working alongside a composer named George Antheil, Hedy had helped devise a frequency-hopping communication system intended to make radio-guided torpedoes harder for enemies to detect and interfere with. The idea was genuinely innovative, decades ahead of what the technology of the time could actually support, and the military did not adopt it. The patent eventually expired without Hedy receiving any financial benefit from it whatsoever. Years later, the principles behind it were recognized as foundational to the development of modern wireless communication technologies, but by then it was far too late for Hedy to benefit in any practical sense. Anthony was acutely aware of all this, and he found it deeply unjust. His mother had contributed something real and significant to the world, and the world had responded by talking about her looks. In his younger years, Anthony tried acting, before eventually leaving the entertainment industry and building a career in the telephone and communications sector in California. There is something quietly fitting about that, given what his mother had contributed to the history of communication technology, even if the connection was more poetic than deliberate. The work that truly defined his later life, however, had nothing to do with his professional career. In 1997, Hedy received an award from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, recognizing her contribution to communication technology. She was in her 80s and not well enough to attend the ceremony. Anthony accepted the award on her behalf and used the occasion to speak publicly about her intelligence and her vision, arguing that she deserved to be understood as a pioneer rather than a relic of old Hollywood glamour. When Hedy died in January 2000, Anthony and Denise honored her final wish by traveling to Austria and scattering her ashes in the woods outside Vienna. He then spent 14 years lobbying and negotiating until the city of Vienna agreed to grant Hedy an honorary grave in the Central Cemetery, established in 2014. He also co-produced a documentary about his mother called Calling Hedy Lamarr, released in 2004, which drew on personal archives and home videos to paint an honest and loving portrait of her final years. In his later years, he was working towards establishing a permanent museum in Vienna dedicated to her life and legacy, remaining actively involved in that project right up until the end of his life. Anthony Loder died in May 2023 at the age of 76. Because of his efforts, Hedy Lamarr's name appears on parks and public spaces. Her scientific contribution is discussed seriously in the history of technology, and her story is told in a way that includes her mind alongside her face. That did not happen by accident. It happened because her son decided it should, and then refused to stop pushing until it did.